Welcome to our Cognition Matters webinar. Today we are continuing our conversation on working memory, and I'm delighted to be joined by two very special guests today. My name is Polly and I'm an education advisor with Renaissance. Prior to joining Renaissance 3 years ago, I was in the classroom myself. So I was a Senko and assistant head teacher for inclusion within the primary sector. I will now hand over to Dr. Tim so he can introduce himself, and then we'll pass over to Jablai.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Tim Mills, and up until the end of last academic year I was Director of Education for Step Academy Trust, a primary trust in the southeast of England and London. I currently work for the Department for Education, both as a RISE advisor but also drafting the new national curriculum, and I drafted the writing framework which was published last summer. And I'll hand over to my friend and colleague, Jablai.
Thank you, Tim. My name's Jablai Saleh. I'm head teacher of Yenton Primary School, part of Robin Hood Mat. I'm really passionate about teaching and learning, pedagogy, and in particular working memory, which I hope has really impacted on the practice I have continued at school.
Thank you both. Now, last time when we met, we started our discussion on working memory, thinking about what it is and how prevalent it is across our schools in the UK. Today, we're sort of getting into a little bit more of the detail. So my first question to you is, how does working memory present itself in the classroom, and what is the impact that you're seeing on learning?
I guess let Jablai start here because she's actually in schools every day.
Well, I would say first and foremost, it's the children that when you are assessing, you are seeing that they are not achieving or their attainment is not where it should be. So that's kind of like the first indicator. The second indicator would be when you're delivering, and we're really having a focus on our explicit instruction and the I do and the we do, you are seeing children there not performing, not understanding, needing extra support. And the problem is, as an educator, is does this children have restricted working memory, or do they have a special educational need? And that's where, it all begins with. And I suppose for us currently, it's trial and error unless you have a form of screening in place. Tim, I don't know if you want to add from that point.
Yeah, I think, that anyone who's worked in classrooms for any length of time will probably be aware of those children or students, and again, it's not just young children. It's working memory restrictions will affect you throughout your life. Who find it very difficult to maintain and often forget complex material, especially when there are lots of elements to it. So, most of us can cope with 4 or 5 different instructions at the same time. And if you were to think about, for example, when you're writing something, we tend to visualize what it is we're going to write, say a story. Say we may visualize our character walking down the road, going into a shop, buying something, and then coming out of the shop. Now, those are actually 4 different elements which we are holding in our working memory as we write out, and we've supported our working memory by visualizing it. As we write this, probably a complex sentence that includes these 4 elements to it. And that's where our working memory really helps us. It chunks these elements together such that we can hold all of that information and that visual, and it is visual because it's internally visual information within our working memory. Think of a child or a person who can maybe only hold 1 or 2 elements within it. That makes constructing complex sentences much more difficult because the cognitive demand on those children is that much greater. And that's with writing, which is cognitively demanding. If you think with reading as well, if you've got restricted working memory and you are reading a great number of complex sentences with fronted adverbial clauses in them, whereby the main verb sits quite deep into the sentence, you're having to visualize a lot of information before you get to that cognitive release of the verb. And it's always the verb that releases the cognitive load because it tells you what's going on. Consider that for a child who's got a large amount of subordination to get through before they get to that verb. are they really going to understand what it is that is happening in the sentence, because they've got so much demand on their very restricted working memory? And anyone who's tried reading Henry James, whose sentences go on for paragraphs, trying to hold, I have an okay working memory, but trying to hold all that information and follow as I'm going through is really demanding. Very, very demanding if that's restricted. And it's those children who struggle to hold all that amount of information and also follow instructions. They often find following instructions very difficult if you give them 5 instructions. So how are we going to mitigate and mediate these elements that are cognitively much more demanding for these children?
And I think Tim mentioned English there. It's not a coincidence that nationally, writing or the attainment in writing doesn't match, say, the attainment in reading and maths. In maths, I would say some of the procedural knowledge can be seen as a script. So once you've learned it and there's, say, automaticity with how you work out column addition, there's the content and the semantic knowledge where you need to know values of numbers, but you have the procedure is one thing because it's a script. So things like that do help mitigate, but in writing, I just can't see that there is something like that. It's not really procedural in the same way. But not only that, I think as educators, something that enlightened me, I think it was last week we had a visit from Tom Perry, and he wrote the Cognitive Science Review. And we were looking at writing and how we always start perhaps with provocation, or should I say before the writing framework, we started with provocation, because we've kind of been enlightened to the simplistic view, but we're starting with a desirable difficulty. We're saying find in this passage of words, of adverbs, of find the adjective or find the noun, instead of starting, like maths, with the digit, with the number, let's start with the noun. So I think we haven't helped ourselves as educators, but writing is complex.
I think that's really important, Jablai. And just sort of as we talk and as I'm thinking, that what's interesting is different subjects have different demands on different elements of working memory. Now, we're not going to get into huge detail on the visuospatial loop and the phonological loop and the episodic buffer and the executive function, but the executive function is really important because that's the one that kind of holds everything together. So different elements of your working memory can be under greater pressure than others. So if you think about the difference between reading and writing, writing has a huge benefit because you are writing stuff down. And when you have written it down, you can reread it. So, we can teach children with restricted working memory to use writing actually as a hack around their restriction because it can be written down. A reading, on the other hand, meaning has to be created in the moment. So, as I said before, reading very complex sentences to find out what is going on is very, very challenging if you have a restricted working memory, because there isn't really a great hack around that. I had a really interesting conversation with, I do some talks and conferences, and one of the things I ask people to consider is how many children do you know who are good readers, good writers? Everyone says yes, they can think of them. Poor readers, poor writers, yes, you can think of those. You can probably even think of some children who are good at reading comprehension but poor at writing composition. But you will know very few who are great at writing composition and poor at reading comprehension. And it was only afterwards, after one of these, somebody came up to me and said, "That's me." Because when I write, he said, I'm dyslexic. When I write, the speed doesn't matter. I can take my time. I can go back. I can re-look at things. But when I'm reading, I have to make meaning in the moment, and that's much more demanding for somebody with dyslexia. It's also demanding for somebody with a restricted working memory. So that comprehension will be more difficult because of just the amount of information that has to be held in order to understand a sentence.
Really interesting conversation, and as I'm sitting here listening to you, these are all things that you think, oh, I wish I'd thought about that when I was teaching myself. I remember sitting with children, giving them instructions, sending them off. If we were writing a story, I don't know, like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, we've gone through everything in great detail, and then you send them back to their table and they write about their holiday, and it's that sort of thing, isn't it?
That's really interesting, Polly, because they're writing about what they know. And that's the
Yeah.
point, is that it's much easier to write about what you know rather than something the teacher has said, right, we're going to write a, non-chronological report on this.
Yeah.
I remember I was working in a school which was in a difficult and challenging situation. I was in I think it was a year five class, and I was just observing and seeing what was going on. And there was this English lesson, and the teacher, I think, gave 7 or 8 different instructions that we had to do, and then sent us all back to the table. And I was with the children, so I went back to the table. I sat on this table, and I said to this boy beside, because I couldn't remember what it was we had to do, and I said, do you guys know what you're meant to be doing? And there was no support anywhere for it, no scaffolds, nothing up on the board to tell me what order I had to do it. And they said, and the boy next to me said, yeah, I know exactly what I meant to do. And I said, that's brilliant. Can you tell me? And then he went, no, I can't remember any of this. And that's just, that's a child with a normal working memory. And mine, I'm an adult in a year five class, and I can't remember it. So, yeah,
Yeah.
we have to attend to this, both in terms of our pedagogy for teaching all, but also particularly in terms of those children who have a restriction.
Yeah,
And I think,
absolutely.
we're talking about children not remembering. One of our things as practitioners and being in the classroom are, what are those strategies? Tim briefly, kind of mentioned cognitive offloading, but then you have the question of how often, how frequent, when, it's really understanding. So strong assessment for learning tied in with that kind of pedagogy, and having these strategies. Success criteria is one, cognitive offloading is another. Dual coding is something in school that we've really had to work on, because it's not about having a picture on every slide with lots of text. It's having the same picture to represent the same thing. So actually they're retrieving knowledge, that stimulates something in their minds. So strategy is just as important as knowing there's restrictive cognitive or restrictive working memory.
I as well. I'm with you, Polly, on this. I wish I'd known this. My poor first class I had. I mean, they had an okay time. We had a lot of fun. We didn't learn a great deal. And it's that feeling you have when you're teaching in year six, and you think, how can you? What? Nobody taught you this. And you speak to the year four teacher, and they say, no, we did all this. I promise you, we did all this. We covered it all. But they've forgotten it. So. How are we going to ensure that memory, that long-term memory, is sufficiently embedded such that it can support the restricted working memory? Because that's exactly, what Jablai is saying, is that, where do you offload it to? The only way you can support it is through your long-term memory and through external and other supports and scaffolds that will enable those children, and all children actually, to be successful within whatever that learning objective may be. And we all know that, I certainly know as a student teacher, every single lesson I was observed in somebody, that it was, the feedback was always, you tried to do too much, too far, too much, because I was, in those days it was all that entertainment and awe and wonder. Fortunately, we know a little bit more about cognitive science. But then, if you think of the working memory research was done back in the 1950s, we're talking 70, 80 years ago.
Wow.
And,
Wow.
Ebbinghouse's forgetting curve is
Yeah.
140 years ago. It's like we did know this, we just ignored it.
But I think as a head teacher currently, there's hope for everyone. For me, looking on the bright side, yes, we can dwell upon what we've missed, but I've worked in a very highly deprived, well, this school is also in a highly deprived area, and disadvantaged children, nationally, there is a gap, cultural capital gap and other gaps. But now that I think this knowledge means there's hope for everyone, so that's the positive.
Oh, I think absolutely. I think you're right, Jabla. I think, if we focus on working memory and teach according to working memory restrictions, and I mean that for everybody. I don't just mean
Yeah.
for those with restricted working memory. If we focus on that, we will teach much, much better. And also, we'll come back and revise and address those elements that have temporarily been forgotten.
Well, thank you so much, both. I think we could carry on this conversation forever, but unfortunately we are restricted by time. We do have one more session coming up where we'll explore those adaptations and support that we started to talk about today. So one more session to cover that. But thank you so much for today's session. That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.